seemed to make sense to do it this way. So we're going to have a slight change of tack now. These latent force models were something Maurizio worked on with me when he was in Manchester. So I'll do a bit of motivation, and then I'll introduce what the idea of a latent force model is, and then I'll give you some examples of using them with ordinary differential equations and partial differential equations. So we've talked about this, right? That we've got some low-dimensional latent space, and we're mapping it to a data space. But in what I've been saying so far, the low-dimensional latent space is denoted by x, because I think of it as inputs. So why have I changed the notation to f? Because I'm now thinking of it as a function. And that's the main sort of little difference here in the latent force models, a function or a force. So we've got latent functions. And we're in the same situation. We don't know what f should be, but it should kind of be obvious to you that I can put a Gaussian process prior over f from what you've learned, and I'm just going to get a Gaussian process at the end. In fact, what type of Gaussian process am I going to get? Can anyone see what this is similar to? If I have independent Gaussian, if I have a matrix F, which is n data points and q latent dimensions, and I have independent priors over the columns of F, and I'm going to multiply it by a matrix W, what sort of model is that we've already derived?
When the kernels are summed with each other.
When they're summed but also added together. Someone I think said it.
Multiple output.
It's a multiple output, yeah. It's just the Kalman filter type setup, isn't it? So it's just the setup where we've got some kind of function, and might be of time or could be of space, and then we're mapping outwards. Here we'll initially assume it's going to be of time. But I've got a little analogy. I like this analogy for this one. So this is my analogy. In the latent force, well, this is an analogy for all latent variables models. So in a latent variable model, you observe some high-dimensional data object, which in this case is a very well-drawn marionette, I might say. But really the puppeteer, he's clever, right? He can make the marionette, good puppeteers can do amazing things with marionettes, making them do realistic motions, which are high-dimensional, right? But in behind the sort of scene, you know, the hidden hand of the puppeteer is operating sticks that might even just be a couple of different forces he can put in. So maybe he can put in a force which is one twisting that way and one twisting the other way. Actually, they go and tweak the strings as well. But the idea is there, isn't it? You can get quite a high-dimensional movement out from putting in a low-dimensional signal. So that's the sort of idea behind dimensionality reduction. Even if the data wasn't generated like this, or we hope that our movement isn't being generated by someone controlling us with a low-dimensional space, because we like to think we're more complicated than that, you can actually model movement like that. So that's the sort of idea of a latent variable model. So we need to define a probability distribution over F, marginalize it out, is the standard latent variable approach, optimize with respect to W. And then, as we've just seen, if we have a Gaussian distribution over F independently over time, we get probabilistic PCA. So that would be like, in the marionette analogy, that would be like a very juddery hand marionette just doing that, yeah? No temporal continuity, so the puppet just bounces around. So that, now, if we constrain the noise to be diagonal, we have sort of a factor analysis. If the noise is spherical, we have probabilistic PCA. We've just sort of reviewed that. So here's the sort of PCA type prior over time. It's just the white noise prior. It shouldn't even be connected up like this. There's no connectivity on it. It's just noise. Yeah? Independent Gaussian samples at all intervals. Now, in the latent force model, we do two things. We're going to rely on latent variables. So, well, sorry. In a normal Kalman filter type model, you actually put some Brownian motion type thing over your prior over the latent space. And you rely on the latent variables to provide your dynamical information. But here we're going to do something else. We're going to introduce a mechanistic interpretation of what's going on. So we're going to introduce a physical interpretation of this system where these latent functions, F, are forces. And what we're observing really is the displacement of P springs to these forces. So what we get is a force balance equation. So if the spring constants are on a diagonal matrix D, then, so I also have to mention the levers. Where are the levers mentioned? So each dimension output is multiplied by a diagonal matrix D, which gives us the spring constants. But the forces act through a set of levers or pulleys or something. So they're distributed. So there's maybe two forces coming in, but they're being distributed to the springs by a linear matrix. Yeah? So a spring is perceiving some magnification, even a negative magnification of the force. And that's our matrix S, and that's a full matrix, whereas D is a diagonal matrix. Now, if we do that, then we just recover PCA, and W is equal to S times inverse D. So we basically get PCA is this mechanistic model of some latent functions moving around to cause observations to change. But what we're going to do is extend that. So PCA is the case where M and C are 0. And then you've got noise. This equation, Maurizio and I discussed this equation a bit. It's not a correct equation in some sense, but it gives you the right idea. We're also going to have a mass that's responsive to the second derivative of y with respect to time, and a damping coefficient that's responsive to the first derivative of y. So this is a second order mechanical system. Now why do we want to do this? Well, the priors we use in Gaussian processes are reflecting some sort of belief about the regularities of the universe, right? Where does that belief come from? It comes from physics. So the fact that I don't disappear, as I talked about at the beginning, and reappear outside in an instantaneous second is down to your belief about how physics operates. You think that can't happen. So you believe in temporal continuity and smoothness as a result of that. But that's actually really, smoothness in particular, like the exponentiated quadratic covariance can be seen, and we indeed do this in latent force modeling, as I think we'll briefly see later, as the result of a heat equation, a diffusion equation. So heat diffuses. So if you have point sources of heat, slowly it diffuses. And actually, over time, what you get is a response which is driven by a sort of exponentiated quadratic covariance, depending on your initial conditions. So it's got a physical meaning. And these types of diffusions occur all over the place. I mean, it's no surprise when you think about differential equations, they're interesting not because they're usable once to describe one phenomena. They're interesting because I can say mass, spring, damper, resistor, inductor, capacitor, and you all know that's the same equation. It's the same system. It's not the same system at all. It's totally different. But the physics is similar. So the differential equation is similar, so we can abstract the system down to a differential equation. Similar with diffusion, whether it's chemical diffusion or heat diffusion, actually the mechanisms underlying that heat is molecules bouncing into each other, kinetic energy at a very low disordered level. Whereas chemical diffusion is also molecules bouncing, but actually substance moving. So in the diffusion equation for heat, you're actually transferring kinetic energy around, and in the other one, you're moving molecules around. So they're related, but they're not the same. But the equation works in both cases. So the idea is, in latent force modeling, is that all our machine learning models have some kind of loose physics, what I call a weakly mechanistic model underpinning them. And when people write down ordinary differential equations, they think, oh, we were doing a strongly mechanistic model. We know the physics of the system. But we want something in between. We want something where these weak mechanisms like smoothness are there, but they're not dominating the model completely. If you just define a differential equation and you don't put any uncertainty in it, then it is rigid about what it is saying about the system. Yeah? It's deterministic, actually. So in the latent force model paradigm, the idea is you have a physical differential equation, and this one encodes resonance and inertia because it's got masses, but you also have some hidden thing that's driving things. So you've got the flexibility to model different data types. So it's a way of encoding inertia and resonance in your prior, which is something you might want to do. And it's the sort of thing we should be doing. Smoothness is not the only regularity of the universe, is it? I mean, things oscillate all the time. Waves. You can look out and see leaves moving around, and it's because they have mass, right? So smoothness is due to these partial differential equations. Inertia and resonance is due to an ordinary differential equation, which is why we look at this example first. But the lesson is general. You can plug this into any differential equation, linear or nonlinear. It just becomes harder for some differential equations than others. So here's our model of what's going on. So we're modeling the sort of Marionette setup, perhaps. Sorry, that should be a Y down here. With something like this. So here I put the inputs to the force equations are through pulleys. So we've got a man, one force going in over time, or it could be a woman, pulling things like this. And then because there's a couple of pulleys here, these forces are being fed to these mass spring damper systems with different sensitivities. This one's wrapped around twice, this one's wrapped around once. So the force is being distributed across two mass spring dampers, and what we observe is the displacement of these two mass spring dampers, right? And because they'll resonate at different frequencies, they can do wildly different things. So that's the idea in a latent force model. Now notice, actually, this whole system is linear. It's a totally linear system, and that's going to mean we can do everything with Gaussian processes. It would be fun to do this with nonlinear systems, and we have done some of that. And in fact, a guy called Simosaka, who wrote that book I told you to read, he's following this up with nonlinear, efficient ways of doing nonlinear latent force models, and he's also got efficient ways of doing latent force models. So to look at what's going on, what we're going to say is, what we want to do is drive. This is one displacement, observed displacement y, and the differential equation is that the mass times the second derivative of y plus the damper times the first derivative plus the decay, or whatever, the spring constant times the actual value of the function is equal to some offset plus some weighted sum of Gaussian processes. It could be any process actually, but if we keep it Gaussian process and keep the differential equation tractable, then it'll keep the whole system tractable. So, in particular, it turns out if we use these exponentiated quadratic covariances, we can solve for this system analytically the form of the final covariance. And so what kind of weird covariance is that? This is going to be a joint covariance over F, the latent forces, and Y, the observed displacements. So it's a multi-output covariance again. Does that make sense? Hopefully it will on this slide. There's the multi-output covariance. So the solution to that differential equation is in terms of a convolution. I had to get out, when I'd wanted to work on this, I knew that this was true just from knowing the math, knowing the theory, for quite a while. And I'd always wanted to work on Gaussian processes with differential equations, but I didn't have an excuse because I didn't know what my application was going to be. And then a guy called Martino Barenko gave a talk where, in effect, they had a latent force model setup going on. So I went away and I had to get out my undergraduate book on differential equations and use Laplace transforms to solve what this differential equation is. Now, it's an ugly looking thing, isn't it? But it's not as ugly as it looks. What's going on in actuality? Well, I'll talk about what's going on in a minute. For the moment, let's just look at the form of the covariance. This is a multi-output covariance, right? What we've got in this block up here is the marginal covariance of the exponentiated quadratic Gaussian process, the thing you keep looking at and playing with, yeah? And that's driving the system. And then what we see is the cross covariance between that and three different mass spring damper systems. But these mass spring damper systems have got different damping ratios. So this one here, the first one is underdamped. This one is overdamped, and this one's critically damped. They also have a different natural frequency. Bear in mind, so we've learned a bit about Gaussian process covariances and what they mean in, sorry, I shouldn't have put that there, let me put that there. In spectral place, they're a spectral filter, right? So we know that if this is an exponentiated quadratic process, we're driving a mass spring damper with a signal that has this Fourier spectrum, yeah? Now, when I was an engineer, as an undergraduate level, we used to drive differential equations like this, second order differential equations with sinusoids. People do that? Yeah? So that's something with this spectrum, isn't it? And then you used to get these weird beats patterns. You know, if there was a mismatch between the natural frequency and stuff like that, yeah? And in some sense, it looked exciting at the time, but when you think about it for modeling data, pretty boring. You know, no data actually looks like that. What's going on here is there's a whole family of different frequencies driving the system. And you're going to get different behaviors depending on the resonant frequency of the underlying system. Stochastic different behaviors. We're going to see that a little bit on the next slide. So what we can also see is the cross covariances. What do we notice about this one? Got these bands, doesn't it? In fact, the values go negative. Why is that? Think of the damping coefficient. That's a resonant system. So it's got a natural frequency, and the distribution of these bands are associated with the natural frequency. These overdamped and underdamped systems don't exhibit their bands unless they're cross-correlating with the resonant system. Yeah? So this is exactly the effect we want. We've got a Gaussian process that can understand resonance when it exists. In fact, we can learn the parameters. We can learn the mass spring and damper, and they can disappear if the resonance doesn't exist. But we know about inertia. We know things that forces are reversible, right? So if under this system, if you push one way, it will go in one direction. But even if you've not observed pushing in the other direction ever, this model includes the symmetry that things should move in the opposite direction. And we'll see that in an example later. In this way, people have asked me about extrapolation. How can I extrapolate with the Gaussian process? How can I extrapolate with the Gaussian process? You can't really extrapolate with anything. Well, I mean, you can't guarantee good extrapolation. But if you know something about the physics of the system, you can turn extrapolation into interpolation. Right? If we send satellites up into orbit the moon, we've never observed data about the moon, that should be extrapolation, unless you understand the physics of it. You don't need to observe how things go around the moon if you understand the physics of how things object each other, and you've observed stuff before about noise. That's not extrapolation anymore, that's interpolation. So by including physical understanding of the system, you convert extrapolation into interpolation. That's the principle. Make sense? But it's all very dependent on the prior. Yeah? Data plus model equals prediction. Let's get the model right. Think about the model. So this is a pretty funky setup, actually, I think. So here's a sample from this system. In this sample, we're seeing black. It's quite hard to see the black. The black is this curve here. That's annoying. If you've got it on your slides, you should see it better. Black is the driving force here coming from the RBF, right? Red is the underdamped system. Notice we don't have this sort of very fixed, but it's not always at its resonant frequency, because, of course, random things happen. So what happens here is black happens to hit red at the right time, just as red is turning, and then we get a resonance, yeah? And then again here. So red gets really large because black happens to hit it at the right time. Black's the driving force, so it's the person pulling, and he's happened to pull at the right time. If you push someone on a swing, you know, if you push them when they're coming back towards you, then they just stop, don't they? But if you push them at the time when they're just descending, then they resonate, yeah? So this model can capture that, but not capturing in a boring way when you drive things by a sinusoid, because that will never happen. You just get these weird beat patterns. Capture it in a random, stochastic way. And so even though this is a totally linear system, you get these complex behaviors. You can see the critically damped system, the blue is trying to follow black, but it can't follow it because it's got inertia. And green is the underdamped system. So here's another, oh, I thought there was another sample there. Oh yeah, there's another sample. So in this sample, you only see the black. You don't see the red. It's the same parameters. It's the same covariance we've just seen. But just coincidentally in this sample, red never resonates because black keeps hitting it at the wrong time. So the large things you see are black. Red is down here somewhere. It's of course higher variance than the blue and green, but it's still not very prominent. Similar here for, well, here we do get some resonant behavior in red. Red's up large here. Yeah? And there's another one. Okay. So this covariance is what's generating that, but how does that work? Why is this a Gaussian process? Why do I know this is a Gaussian process? Well, a few rules. I'm not sure I covered the integral rule. Let me cover the integral rule. If I did cover the integral rule, didn't I? I can't remember. Who knows? G of t, well, let's call it capital F of t, is some integral between some limits of f of t. If f of t is a Gaussian process, then capital F of t is also a Gaussian process. And that's kind of trivially true in some sense, because an integral is just a sum. It's just an infinite sum, right? So all that this is saying is that that still applies in the continuous space. So this is the equivalent of saying something like, well, in fact, let me even add g of t here and call this h of t. So g of t is now a deterministic function, and I multiply it by f of t and adding together. So in a discrete world, what is that? Multiply something by something else and add it together. If we turn these into vectors, that would be what?
Inner product.
The inner product, yeah. G transpose F. This is just a continuous version of an inner product. So we're just saying that H is equal to G transpose F. Now these rules about multivariate Gaussians extend to the continuous space. So if I said F was a Gaussian, then I would know that the covariance in it, so F is a multivariate thing, and G is just a vector here. So if F was drawn from a Gaussian with zero mean, I'm trying to draw it too quickly. F is drawn from a Gaussian with zero mean and covariance k, let's say. Then H will be drawn from a Gaussian with zero mean and variance, because it's a scalar, because it's the result of an inner product. And variance will be, does anyone know? G transpose, yeah. K, G, yeah, good. Yeah? So if this inner product is an integral, what do you think the covariance of H is in this case? This is just two inner products, isn't it? So it turns out, I mean, obviously I'm not proving this, but I'm just trying to give you intuition for why this works. It turns out that the covariance for H, KH I'll call that, is equal to the integral of G of t, K t comma t prime, G of t prime, dt, dt prime. This is just the integral equivalent of that matrix inner product. So that gives me the marginal covariance for H, but I can also compute the cross covariance. So the cross covariance between KH and F, which is a function of t and t prime, is equal to the integral of G of t, kt, comma t prime, d u, so I should say k u, comma k of u comma t prime, and then put the limits between naught and t there to make it work in the way I've done the notation. But you get the general idea. I mean, there's limits issues and you have to set that up correctly, but it's just a convolution of the function, which in this case is this deterministic function is exponential times sine, the classic decaying sine wave that you get out of a second order system, the impulse response actually, and the driving function. It's a convolution of those two. Now this turns out to be true in general, that whatever the differential equation you're building, you need to solve the convolution of the Green's function, which is the impulse response for partial differential equations, with the Gaussian process that drives the system. So you take your favorite, so the Green's function, for example, for the heat equation is like a Gaussian form. And when you drive it with a Gaussian process, and f of t therefore has an exponentiated quadratic, if you use an exponentiated quadratic, this integral is tractable. So we'll see that example later. So that's a partial differential equation. In this case, it's just a second order differential equation. And it turns out that this is tractable too. So it's an amount of work to compute. But actually, if you start taking the state space perspective on these models, these integrals become kind of trivial. So Shimosaka And I just did a thesis, Uni Hartikainen, did a thesis on latent force models using the state space approach, efficient, fast approaches to these things. And he was doing these latent force models over tens of thousands of data. And he's now doing them with a company that does inverse problems in northern Finland. So they're all being used commercially, which is quite cool. But in terms of the way we constructed these things, it would be hard to do that. So they constructed them in a slightly different way. So let me show you an example of this to try and persuade you of the merits of the idea. Need to get rid of that. Now I'm going to have some trouble in moving. I did test this earlier, and my MATLAB plots will appear on this screen, and I'm going to have to move them across really quickly. So we'll see how well I do. So I'm going to show you the training data first. And the training data, this is motion capture example. So it is like the puppet. So it's data from someone. See, I do this. I always say, so you guys know Karate Kid, the film Karate Kid? And well, yes. Like Mauricio knows it because he's within 10 years of my age. And everyone else is like, what's he talking about? Well, in Karate Kid, the guy learns this move, doesn't he?
They know the new version. Will Smith's son.
But does he still do the same move?
I don't know.
Because it was all about this stupid move that looks really easy to hit him in. At the end you had to do this, and then you had to kick someone or something. Anyway, so this is like people starting to do the Karate Kid move is the data. The data is people commencing to do the Karate Kid move. Now, I do believe in sort of pointing out the weaknesses in your model. Modeling motion capture like this is great, and this works quite well. We purposefully chose a data set where there weren't floor contacts and things like that. So people weren't bumping into walls, right? Because the force of bumping into a wall is not a Gaussian process. We need a discrete force for that. And Maurizio did this switched latent force models, which allow discrete forces. So we solved that later. I mean, but in this case, we purposefully chose an example where someone was just moving freely. I mean, this can all be Gaussian process driven now, yeah? Because Gaussian processes are more like ballet. Okay, so I'm going to show you the training data, the Karate Kid move, but I'm going to have to be quick to move it across. It's going to appear, and then I have to move it left, I think. Oh, here it comes. Oh, I failed. It's because I had to move it right, actually. Okay, so that's one motion. I'll repeat it in a second, actually. Oh, I've missed it again. There's the other one. So the problem is Maurizio wrote this code cleverly to clear when I run it again, so I'll have to try this. I'll see if I can do better now. Repeat. So there we go. Okay, you get the idea of the motion. So there's two motions here. That's motion one. Oh, all right, and there's motion two. So it's just a guy sort of standing up, and he sort of does this. Now then we had a test data set. We're going to show you. The test isn't very important for the initial demo, but we also had test data, and the test we specifically chose to be the most exaggerated of the three motions. Two of the motions were similar, and the other motion he sort of did more with his arms, didn't he? He went wider with his arms like this. So we chose that to be the test data, because our theory was that that was like an extrapolation, but it wasn't an extrapolation if you understood inertia and forces and all these sort of things. Does that make sense? So we were trying to test this theory that the model could extrapolate better because it wasn't extrapolating anymore. Seems to make sense, yeah? So here's the test data, but it'll just look similar-ish to you if I remember to... Oh, here we go. Oh. I guess actually he looks like he sort of loses balance a bit while he's doing it. So maybe that's why the... So next we're going to do the puppet. So what you're going to see now, and this will be more calm because I can move the plots across. So Maurizio showed this at AI Stats. This was a talk at AI Stats. In which year? 2009? 2009 AI Stats, and this is the demo Maurizio wrote for that talk. So what's going on here? So this on the right for you, isn't it? The right is Y, the observations. And I do like doing this way of doing observations. So you take some high-dimensional data that you can visualize well, like a human. You're good at visualizing high-dimensional data if I make it a stick man, yeah? And this is F, the latent space, or X as we had it before. Now, I want to be able to move in the latent space and therefore control the man. But the dynamics of my movement are important. So what we're going to do is record a move here and then play, once I finish recording, what the man does. These are the training motions. Motion 18 and motion 19 involve these latent forces. So this is the mean of the latent forces, right? We can look at the posterior over these latent forces. Given our observations of the training data, we can do this cross-mapping. It's a reverse convolution, which some people claim is very difficult to do, not in this formalism. We can deconvolve the signal, trivially, just through Gaussian process prediction. Remember those formulae for Gaussian process prediction? The mean is equal to... So we didn't observe the latent force, but we observed y, and we can build a covariance between y and itself. That's the result of the double integral, this one. And we can build a cross covariance between f and y. That's the result of the single integral, this one. This looks like the mean prediction, only normally in the mean prediction we are saying f, so y star y, 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 or f star f, 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 yeah? But also it came up with the inducing variable situation where we had fu, uu. It's just the mean prediction. So by automatically observing y, we use those blocks of the covariance that we visualized earlier to just tell us what f should be in the mean, and then of course we get a k ff minus k fy k yy inverse k yf for the covariance. So we've got an entire, so I'm just visualizing the mean, but actually there's an entire sustained distribution over those latent values, the puppet values. So now what I'll do is I'll generate a new f and run the model forward. So I'll try and follow this motion here, or I've already messed it up, to try and recreate what he did in the training data. So I went too high. Do you notice his leg bent back? The jumping forward is just to do with our coding. It's not to do with the model. It wouldn't jump in practice. So let's try that again, just to sort of give you the idea. But I'll stay a bit longer down here now. So now he goes into a more crouched position that we never saw in the original data. Now, of course, there's limitations to this, and we can see some of those limitations if I make the poor man go sort of in this direction, where it's never done anything before. Ow. It doesn't know that your knee can't go that way. It knows that that would be the effect of reversing the forces that push your knee in that direction, and those effects would be to hinge that all the way through, yeah? Because when you're going up like that, you're causing your knee to bend inwards. So now it says, well, if you go in the other direction, you cause your knee to bend outwards. That's what's in the prior, isn't it, effectively? Because the forces are reversible. But because those forces are reversible, we can get some, we can bring him down here, and then I'll attempt to sort of bring him back. So he comes forward, and then he goes backwards, right? Which is something he never did in the data. That's unseen. That's a combination of a physical assumption about what's generating this data and the data itself to give us a prediction about what should happen if we reverse the force. So it's not smoothness, it's a different type of universal regularity that applies sometimes. Yeah? And that's what I think we should be putting in models to improve predictions. Okay. I've mainly used this direction, so just to finally say one thing, this other direction here doesn't seem to do much. So it may be that it's dealing with even that little motion you're seeing there is mainly due to me just moving down here. If I try and stay in 0 in this axis, then he really doesn't do very much at all. But I think what may be happening is if you see the end of his arms, they do oscillate a little bit. Now, this data is all encoded in angles, right? So you're observing the big angles here, but if he does anything with his hand there, as far as the model's concerned, that's just as important, even though you can't see it very well. And it may be, we certainly know that his arms resonate a bit, and it may be that the force going left or right is really focused on making his arms resonate, which you don't tend to see when we move the whole picture. Okay, so back to the slides. Somehow I don't get to see my slides on this. Here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go. No, somehow my slides just die when I do that. Okay, so I'll restart the slides. And they'll probably... I think I'll have to jump all the way through. How annoying. Oh, come on. Oh, I've jumped too far now. Oh. Okay, so, all right, here we go. Yeah. So actually, here we did some work with just taking particular parts of that motion to try and compare with other models. So we just took the left arm and we said, how does the left arm move? We observe motion 18 and 19, and then we look at the exaggerated motion. We build models on 18 and 19, and we try and predict how things will work for model 20. Right? So what Maurizio did here was he trained on 18 and 19 and tests on 20. We downsampled the data from 120 frames per second to 32. And we reconstruct the left arm. Now, the way we reconstruct the left arm is by taking in 3 angles at the beginning here, and then seeing, that's our input data. So we know the 3 angles of the motion here, and we try and cross-predict what the other angles will do. So these 3 angles are in effect telling us something about the latent force, which then moves forward to tell us something about what the rest of the arm should do. But there's all sorts of dynamical information. And we chose that sort of setup so we could compare with the direct regression, where the regression is just having as an input 3 angles here and a target all the other angles. So it doesn't know about time or anything, it just sees this as a data set. But it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. So for the regression model, this later exaggerated motion should be an extrapolation, because it hasn't seen that type of thing. In some sense, it's also an extrapolation for the latent force model, but because it knows about dynamics, and if the motion is exaggerated here, the model should exaggerate it down the whole arm. So what we find is that we do, okay, so apart from the radius, which is, I guess, is it that one? So I guess you don't get much information from the radius from looking at those 3 angles. We do better on all the other measures in terms of prediction error. And this really shows us why we capture these sort of flips here. So this is the classic thing that the regression model can't capture. So here's our inferred latent force. Here's a prediction about what the wrist does and from the regression model and what we predict the wrist does. The dots here are the truth. So in this hand rotation, for example, this little fluctuation here we capture, whereas the regression model is extrapolation, and it's a Gaussian process regression, so it just does the sensible thing. It reverts to the mean with high variance. In fact, it hasn't seen any of this stuff before, so it just predicts mean with high variance. Similar here, look at this. So we're still high variance, we're still uncertain, but we capture these little forms here. So we end up picking up these extrapolations in the data. Okay, so the next one was this similar predictions, but with larger experiments on walkers using someone and a golf swing, wasn't it? So Maurizio did a similar style of experiment, but in this case he compared with some of those multitask GPs that you saw yesterday, multi-output GPs, semi-parametric latent factor models, and putting the physics in helps. So we sort of beat the other models. You need to do experiments like that for the journal version of the paper. Okay, so I'll give you another example of application of this. So this is a first order differential equation that we're going to use for transcriptional regulation modeling. So in this case, what we're observing is gene expression levels. I won't spend too long talking about what gene expression is. Do people know what gene expression is? So in your cells, each cell has the same genes in it, but you switch different genes on according to the function of the cell. And these genes are encoded by you can measure what genes are switched on by measuring the RNA. But they're actually being switched on by things called transcription factors that are proteins, which are difficult to measure. So in this case, the protein is the latent force. We observe the mRNA, And this is our little model of transcriptional regulation, simple model. This was actually the original example from Barenko that allowed us to start working on these things. So this is the paper that inspired us to construct this model for the first time. And Pei Gao is my postdoc, and we show results on this in a paper there. So we've got the concentration of the gene's RNA, which is something we can measure, and then we've got the concentration of active transcription factor that's turning on the RNA. We can't measure that. And there's some other parameters associated with the transcription, like a baseline transcription rate, a sensitivity, and a decay rate. The mRNA tends to decay over time, which is why we need this type of system. So how do we fit the model when P of t is not observed? Well, we use the same thing again. We get a different convolution and a different looking covariance function. But here now we've got the RBF covariance over the protein, and then these are the derived measurements under different parameterizations for the mRNAs. So the first one of these is a high decay, high sensitivity mRNA. And if you look at what that means, if sensitivity and decay are high, what happens if I put up decay and sensitivity to 1,000 here? If you reorder this equation, you put m of t on that side, and this is not being scaled up by 1,000. So this is insignificant, and you get m of t equals p of t. So that's a domain that often people search for things in. It's when this first order differential equation just becomes linear. Well, an instantaneously linear relationship is always linear. So that's why this one correlates very strongly here. Because in this domain it's saying, you're pretty much the same as this because your decay and high sensitivity is high. The other ones have lower decays and lower sensitivities, and they become a bit more diffuse. So again, we can look at samples. In this case, the sample, the black is the protein, the red is the high decay, high sensitivity, which looks very similar. The green is medium decay, the blue low decay. So you get them following in a different way. Now, there's some other samples, same parameters, same thing happens. So what I want to show you, I couldn't get these crosses, I tried to fix these crosses, they're too big. But is what happens in this system as you bring in data. So we're making observations of the gene expression level, and what we're going to do is do inference, posterior predictions over the protein level. Now this is an artificial system here. I generated the data using this bump for P of t. So we're expecting to see, as we get more and more data in, inference over what P of t was. Of course, there are parameters of this system, decays and sensitivities, and I did learn those, but they're learnt before we're doing this. They've been pre-learnt, and now what you're seeing is measurements coming in from this one here, which is a high sensitivity, low decay. So it's basically an integral of the protein. This one here, which is a high sensitivity, medium decay, and this one here, high sensitivity, high decay. But I'm going to bring in the observations one point at a time and update the inference over the posterior so you can see the error bars and so on and so forth, he says, and then doesn't do that. So these are the observations, and they got realistic noise. So sometimes it hallucinates bumps that aren't there. You see this noisy point here? That causes it to hallucinate a downward bump. Yeah? So you get the idea? So this is the inference over f of t, or we've called it p of t here, because it's protein. But let's think of it as f of t as we introduce new points. So even though there's large noise on these points, of course if we observe over multiple related outputs, we start to become fairly confident about what about what the system did. Yeah? I have to remember not to do that this time. Yeah? So we can get this inference about what the underlying latent force was. Okay, so there's an application of this to something called P53, which is a damage repair transcription factor. So P53 is when you spend too long in the sun or radiation damages your cells, P53 is in charge of putting the chromosomes back together. And that's kind of an artistic view of what it looks like in the cell. These cells are extraordinary. This is your DNA being wound up all over the place. This is a bit of unwound DNA where someone's transcribing P53. This is the P53. This is RNA transcriptase, producing the RNA, which is what we can measure. So we've got these targets of P53, and we measure the gene expression of these 5 targets. So P53 is controlling these 5 targets, and this is the model that Martino Barenko used, using this same differential equation that we've just looked at. And then we published the results of this model in this paper, which was in Bioinformatics, ECCB. And we can do inference, given what we observe as the gene expression, about what the P53 was and what the target genes were. Now in this case, we've got all the parameters, and the decay and sensitivity are relatively high, so actually the P53 looks similar to the genes. That's not surprising, because most models people use to try and identify commonality assume that. They use linear models. So the known targets, interestingly, do look like the latent target, because that's all people have been able to find before. But you can then use this model to find other potential targets. So here's an example where that's not true. This was an alternative example that Jennifer Withers did when we were in Manchester, where you've got some different potential targets which have different shapes. And so you want to know, is this a target of this? Which it could be. So these are sort of all targets that work under this model. Now that's very different to that, but it's still a potential target of this, because it's integrating it. And that's very common in gene expression. You get these integration type effects. So this one here, is it a target? Well, it's predicted not to be, because the data's up here. And then the best we could do in terms of getting fit by moving parameters around and using this latent function was to put a function there. So you can use this sort of thing. You know, the problem is I'm not sure I'd be able to tell whether that was a target or not without using this model. So this idea, we took it even further with Antti Honkola and Magnus Rattray, my collaborator on this. And we've got PNAS paper where we actually use a cascade model. So in this model, we go one stage further. We push one Gaussian process through, well, we say that the protein itself is also the result of a differential equation of some governing mRNA. And then that, in turn, drives another differential equation. So we've got cascades of differential equations. We've got one Gaussian process. We've got a Gaussian process over an mRNA concentration, which goes through a convolution to produce a protein, which goes through a convolution to produce a second mRNA. So one differential equation feeding another. And this is the form of the covariance, where we can now look over the governing mRNA, the hidden protein, and the target mRNAs. And this is much more constraining. So for example, we've got the mRNA so all proteins have their own mRNA to produce them. And in developmental systems, it's often the case that you go mRNA to protein to mRNA. So this is what we've got in this case here. We want to know, is this here a potential target of an mRNA that looks like this? And we fit the model, and what the model says is, look, if this were the original function, this could be the inferred protein that you didn't observe, and that would lead to this fit here, which is a pretty good fit. So this was a very highly ranked potential target. You want to know, is this guy affecting this guy? And this was one of the top ranked things. Here's another one. But this is very different, because this is all high decay, high sensitivity. So this guy, it's the same guy again, but it says, yeah, he could affect this guy, and for him to do so, he would have to affect him in this way. Now, both those things can't be possible, because there's only one twist protein in the system. So the question is it that or that? Well, we don't know, but here's a couple of others that exhibit the second one, yeah? So we've got 4 highly ranked targets here. That's 1, 2, 3, 4. The last 2 match the first one, yeah? Now, it is possible that this is an additional target and there's some sort of phosphorylation of this protein, so the protein changes state or something like that. We don't know. That's an open question. But when we said this to the biologist, we find that the twist is acting in 2 different ways. It's acting early and it's acting late. She said, oh, that's not new. We already knew that. But they knew it from experiment, whereas we did it from just looking at gene expression data, not even their gene expression data. So you can pull out these quite interesting features in the model. I don't know what the end conclusion was of that, how that was happening, why that was happening. There's a 5th one that matches the first thing, and there's a final one that matches the second. So it did seem to be working in these 2 different ways. So these are some evaluation methods that show that method did very well. So we can do this stuff across partial differential equations. That's work of Maurizio to do this spatially. And he did this work on, so first of all, Maurizio found this book of Green's functions, isn't it?
Always, isn't it?
Yeah, this
is in the book.
So this is the bumper book of Green's functions. So in order to solve these systems, you need to get the Green's functions, the impulse response to the differential equation, because the Green's function always appears in here. Yeah? So some guy called Palyanin prepared like a bumper boys book of Green's functions, and it just gives you the Green's function for all sorts of partial differential equations and says what the impulse response is. So Maurizio found this book, and then sort of we could go through it and say, oh, we can solve that one, oh, we can solve this one, because the Green's function was tractable for us to combine to do this integral. Not all of them are going to be tractable, right? But it was tractable. The ones that were tractable we looked at. So so in this heat equation system, here, the Green's function is this. It's got a Gaussian form. So Maurizio used this to, unfortunately I go off screen here, but this is like the KYY that comes out of this system, the result of the double integral, and then below here, hidden, for all future reference, is the KYF. So if you've got a latent function that's a Gaussian. So in this case, the interpretation is actually that the latent force is the initial condition of how temperature was laid down in the system. So it's saying if we laid down temperature initially as a Gaussian process, how would temperature evolve over time? And let's look at it at a particular time in future. How would it spatially be? And this gives us the answer to that. So that's like a multi-output covariance, which is based on a convolution. So you've got all these different y's, but no longer is it separable or a sum of separable that you saw before. What it is, it's an infinite sum of separable, I suppose. I haven't really thought about that. But these things are the result of convolving. So how's the multi-output working here? Each y is dependent on a single f, but it's dependent through an integral. It's not just through an inner product, set of inner products. It's through an integral, continuous inner product over space. So it's a more complicated covariance function than the ones you guys worked with yesterday. So Maurizio did some experiments to show that this, you could compare this approach to things with independent Gaussian processes and this diffusion covariance that we used here, and ordinary co-Kriging, which is some variant of what you guys were doing the other day, and showed that we did better than the other approaches. I won't go into the efficient approximations, but what a lot of what Maurizio did is worked out sparse approximations for solving these systems, and we've got a JMLR paper on that. So the latent force model work has really been a strand of research for quite some time, with several awards, including this one was with Maurizio, this Google Research Award, mechanically inspired convolution processes for learning. But we also used it as the basis of these Gaussian processes for systems identification with applications in systems biology, and improved processing of microarray data with probabilistic models was funding Pei Gao, who did some of the early work. Michalis Tsitsias was on this grant, and he actually did work with non-linear latent force models, which I haven't shown you today, where you move away from these linear differential equations. David Luengo visited us and worked with Maurizio on the second order latent force model. And Maurizio was funded by University of Manchester Computer Science Studentship and an Overseas Research Award. So lots of different funding. I mean, I think these ideas are generally very applicable. And even though we've exploited them a lot, there's a lot more you could do with this stuff. Combining differential equations with Gaussian processes to add mechanism in. We're hoping that we're not going to do a big lab on latent force models now yet, because we're still implementing that in GPy. But we've all got all sorts of ideas of how to do that in a very general way, so that you can, instead of having to do all these integrals, that you can get those things to be automatically computed for you, that you can just specify what you want to say about the model. Just give it the integral. Say, these functions are related through this differential equation. And then GPy goes away and does everything. Says, OK, here's your covariance. Yeah, and then you can start fitting the model. So you don't have to spend ages like poor Maurizio did computing the integrals for these covariances. But that's quite a big project because it involves all sorts of things like making sure things are numerically stable, ensuring that the symbolic Python code knows how to do the differentiations correctly, various things. And there's also another strand to that work is work with Arno Solin and Simo Saka to try and do the same thing with state space models. Okay. References. Look at that. Alvarez, 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 Alvarez. Always have your name start with an A. He was quite a productive PhD student. Yeah, this switch latent force model stuff here is something, again, that we've not really fully exploited yet, but it explained how to add discontinuities into these latent forces, which you can't do with the Gaussian processes. And this variational inducing kernels, that's another underexploited idea which we want to build on a bit more, I think. So here, what we did is, so you know I said to you, you've got these inducing kernels, right? These inducing variables, and they don't have to be in the same space as functions. Well, when I was writing on the board here, I also said it looks similar if it's KFU. You could build, the inducing kernel idea is that you construct things, linear operators, just to store information about your function. You don't construct this because you believe that it's a good way of modeling your data. You construct an object like this because you believe it's a good way of storing what you need to know about the data in a short way. It's compressing the data well. It's a good inducing variable to store. So you sort of build, you say that this is an inducing variable and it's related to the underlying function like this. And if you make that a Fourier transform, if you say it's related, the convolution is the Fourier transform, then you get inducing variables in Fourier space. But you could make it anything you like. Any other things? Yeah, various... I don't have Simo's. I need to reference Simo on this because he's doing a lot of interesting follow-up work. And there's quite a lot of references there for you to have a look at. Okay, so questions? I've got loads more material. You're all looking really tired. So, any questions? If not, maybe we should break again for what we've got. It's just past where I intended to be 11:30, so it's 25 to 12. So we'll break for 10 minutes till 11:45, and then we'll go back to the Gaussian process latent variable models. So we'll go in the opposite direction. We're going to finish with latent force models. I don't have a lab for you. We wondered about getting a lab together, but really we need these things to be... The demos, the reason I showed you demos in MATLAB is because we're still more functional in our MATLAB code that Maurizio wrote than we are in our Python code for latent force models. We've got some latent force modeling stuff there, but since Maurizio is not in the lab to say, hey, why didn't you implement in Python anymore, we don't have an implementation.
Christian for doing that.
Yeah. So we're gonna, this is indirect, this is Christian's future. Folding out. We've got a lot of, I think, interesting ideas about how we could do that. Not just an implementation way, because we don't want to, I think you've seen from GPy, we don't want to implement these things in just such a way that you have to spend ages writing the algorithms yourself. We'd like to be able to implement these latent force models in such a way that you say what you think about the data, and then the computer does all this stuff on its own. And that's reasonably complicated when what you say about the data is relating things by linear operators. So I think it's going to, if Christian's up for it, there's lots of interesting things to get a really nice implementation of this stuff here. And the really nice thing about these models is they're totally underexploited. So what? There's 2 or 3 applications. This guy Juni Hartikainen's done them in inverse systems. We've done them a bit in systems biology, but you could envisage them being used in control. You could envisage them being used in all sorts of application domains, particularly in engineering. But what it would need is a nice implementation that people find easy to use and deal with, which hopefully we could do in GPy. Okay, so we'll break until 11:45.